Okay.
Okay. So, hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth Motivated Cognition meeting of 2023. Just some logistics first. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you. Or you can use the Q&A function to write your question or just type that you have a question. Dr. Braver has said that he can be interrupted if you have a question that you want to be answered during the talk. But at the end, we'll have about 25 minutes for discussion where it can be a little bit more interactive. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Todd Braver as our fourth and final speaker of 2023 Motivated Cognition Meetings. Dr. Braver is a professor of psychological and brain sciences, radiology, and neuroscience at Washington University in St. Louis. He's also the William R. Stuckenberg Professor in Human Values and Moral Development. Dr. Braver is the co-director of the Cognitive Control and Psychopathology Lab. His lab uses computational modeling, functional neuroimaging, and behavioral studies to examine how humans exert control over their thoughts and behavior and what happens when this control breaks down. His work focuses on the cognitive and neural mechanisms underlying memory, attention, and controlled processing. It's widely known that Dr. Braver is a fantastic mentor, having many mentees that went on to have highly successful careers themselves, and for which he received the Outstanding Faculty Mentor Award at WashU in 2019. Today, he will be talking to us about the interactions of motivation and cognitive control. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Braver.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for joining at whatever time zone you're on. I appreciate you being here and great to be invited and get a chance to talk with you. So I like to start this off with just a kind of, what I feel like is kind of this perennial question about that we as academics and many people around the world face every day, whether you feel like at a particular moment you're going to be willing to work or think hard, or instead you want to take a mental and physical break and just chill. And this really kind of brings up this idea that cognitive control might really be tightly linked with motivation. And I just have to admit, maybe too much information, but that I just encountered this last night and this morning, in which I knew about this talk, but I've been very, very busy. And so I kept thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to go look at the slides. I had some other talks that were similar to this. And last night I had a long day that didn't end till 9 o'clock. And I'd been planning I was going to work on my slides after that got done. And instead I said, oh, I'm really too tired, so I'm just going to do the Netflix and chill. But then I said, okay, I really owe it to these guys that I should at least try to update my slides and make it, a useful talk. So I said, okay, I'm going to set my alarm to get up early in the morning. And even though I'm not an early morning person, I did, and I started working on this at my 7 a.m., which is not easy for me, but I was motivated to do it because I wanted to make sure at least I put some work into this talk and thought about it for you guys and hopefully made it useful. So that perennial question impacted me. So I hope I gave enough time to make it useful. We'll see. Then the other, thing that struck me, I kind of went back and thought about how I initially got interested in this. And, for me, it really came back to thinking about when I was working with cognitive participants and tasks, and then having this kind of interaction with them. And this just kind of summarizes many anecdotes. One participant, well, I tried my best, but I got 2 or 3 wrong. Hey, man, can I try it again? I know I could do better. Very motivated participant, very conscientious. And then other participant, notice you're not really looking at display. You see me pushing the buttons randomly. Well, I'm going to do this experiment as a course requirement. I'm pretty bored. I just zoned out, right? So, variability in the kind of motivation. And it's something that, I think everybody knows. And it's kind of like we just say, oh, you had a motivated or unmotivated participant. And, what does that really mean? I'll just put this up while I'm talking. This is, just a XKCD, but funny about really bad participants. And an experimenter dealing with them. But this is what got me started, thinking about this, that, what we needed to start doing was trying to experimentally control motivation, if we wanted to at least put it as an explanation of what was happening in cognitive behavioral performance or cognitive neuroscience studies. And that's, I'll just say, came from a book that wound up coming back. And I was looking it over. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember writing that, which has now been a few years ago. But even before that, as we were talking about before this, as I started thinking about this, it really became clear to me that I needed to understand more about motivation. And that's what led to organizing a conference now, I guess it was over 10 years ago, but this is really exciting for any of you that are, kind of junior in the field or thinking about ways to get, I found it to be very productive and stimulating to think about getting a lot of really smart people into the room from a lot of different perspectives to think about these questions. And so we put on this conference. I just did a conference just a couple months ago on a completely different topic, but it reminded me how much I really enjoyed doing that. Got a lot out of it. And we also, in addition to that book, we also wrote a paper that was really fun to write, and group author paper. And so I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but there's a lot of issues in this domain, and both the book and this special issue that came out and this particular group author paper were really an attempt to try to encapsulate and scope a lot of the issues. So there's way too many for me to talk about in a talk like today, but I still think, going back over the book and that paper before giving this talk today, that there's a lot of really interesting issues. There's still a lot of fertile ground to be investigated. So if you're interested in looking for research questions or getting a survey, those could be good places to start for you if you don't know about the papers are in that book already. But, for today, what I wanted to go about is, when I started thinking about this and really started trying to learn a little bit about motivation, and I don't claim to be an expert on motivation really by any means, but, it struck me just going back that, you can find interesting writings, and it is something that people think about and have thought about for, hundreds, if not thousands of years. And this quote from Descartes, even though written, almost 400 years ago, on the passions, and he said they dispose the soul to desire the things which nature tells us are of use, and to persist in this desire, and also to bring about that same agitation of spirits which customarily causes them to dispose the body to movement, carrying into effect those desired things. So a little bit different kind of writing style than we would use today. But, it's really interesting to me that this kind of quote just brings out what I think are, core dimensions of motivation in terms of how we might think about them interacting with cognition, so the idea of value. So, those things which nature tells us are of use. This idea that there's a kind of affect and anticipatory component to motivation. He talks about the passions and persisting in desire. That motivation has this activation or energization function, and talking about agitation of the spirits maybe is a very colorful way to refer to that. But I think we can all relate to what that means is thinking about being energized for things that we're motivated for, and that the motivation also, though, seems to be directed in a goal-oriented way, and so carrying into effect those desired things and disposing the body and movement. So really want to think about all of these dimensions, and I think they're really important, when we're studying them, and motivation and cognition. So, what I'll just talk about today are things that motivated me to, in this work, and that, we're still kind of working on today, but I think are interesting questions. So, there's the what question. What kind of cognitive control and what aspects are being, engaged by motivation? So, we've argued that it's really related to this dimension of proactive cognitive control. and why, why is motivation interacting with cognitive control, and that maybe that we need to have some mechanism by which we're integrating subjective motivational value, and that is the kind of core dimension in which control is modulated by. And then how, what are the mechanisms? And so we've argued, and I think others now are arguing this, that maybe there's some role for motivation and sharpening the neural coding of task and goal representations. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these, but again, just to reemphasize, I probably have more than 35 minutes here, so I'm happy to just go through some of this quickly, but if anybody wants me to elaborate, I don't have to go through all of it. Just stop me if there's something you want to learn more about. Okay. So, we kind of independently of this, but in some ways very interactively, have been interested in this framework about thinking of cognitive control in terms of these proactive and reactive modes and this distinction between these two dimensions. And there's a couple of key features that I think are really important, but probably the first one is most important for thinking about this today, which is the idea that there is this cost-benefit trade-off in how we deploy cognitive control, and that we might have these different modes because of that trade-off. And in particular, this proactive mode of control might be maybe a more effective mode, but also computationally costly. And I don't have the time to go into all the details about that, but we've talked about this in a number of different places. And because of that trade-off, that might be a source of variability, that how individuals utilize the mode of control might vary both across situations within an individual and across individuals as well, so that there's this important source of variability. And then in terms of the kind of operating characteristics, that these modes have different characteristics in terms of their temporal dynamics. And so one might be thought of as more of a goal maintenance mode, the proactive mode, whereas the other is more of a transient kind of reactivation of control mode. And just to show this briefly, we've highlighted the idea that in many situations you can think about context or a task goal or a rule being available somehow to the system, and that can be encoded. And we've argued that there's a critical role for the dopamine and basal ganglia system in serving to gate that information. And then if that happens appropriately, then it would be maintained within the lateral prefrontal cortex and then used as a kind of bias signal to engage preparatory processes or attentional configuration prior to the onset of some particular target. So that's this idea of proactive control being kind of a future-oriented preparatory mode of control. And the idea, though, about the cost is that it's costly to maintain goal information in this active maintenance form where it's kind of biasing ongoing processing. There's a limited capacity system. And so there might be a bias against doing that if that's not deemed to be the most effective mode. And that just kind of contrasts with this other mode of reactive control, in which the context information or goal information might be transiently encoded, but then not maintained in this goal maintenance form within prefrontal cortex, and then dependent upon kind of transient events happening at the time of target, kind of imperative changes based on maybe conflict detection or the features of the target being episodically or associatively linked to that goal or context and allowing it to be retrieved. So this just distinct modes, we've thought about and worked on as being pretty important. And where it's relevant for the kind of motivation is when we think about, how motivational value might play a role here. And so just as one example, this was a study that a former graduate student, Kim Chu, who is now at University of Denver, developed, where we took a kind of standard attention cognitive control task, the flankers task, which probably many of has this kind of dimension in which the stimuli can be congruent or incongruent, and it creates interference, even if you're, know to be focusing attention on this central target feature, that the flankers can cause interference. And what we did is to kind of look at the role of proactive control. We utilized a cued version in which cues that came before the stimuli indicated some of the time whether it was going to be incongruent or neutral or congruent. We also had uninformative cues as well. So the idea was participants, if they made use of these cues when they were informative, could really prepare appropriately for the attentional demands present at the target. We also, just as an aside, we in this study, when we were looking at the role of incentives, we used primary incentives here. And we've kind of been interested, although we haven't done it in all studies, in this idea, and I'll come back to this in a bit, that looking at primary incentives might be really important for getting at motivational properties in experimental studies, and looking at the role of motivation rather than just kind of monetary stimuli. But the key idea here was that we can pair the cues with reward cue information. So that means that on some trials, in addition to the variation in the information that was provided, we also gave information about whether a reward was available or not, meaning this liquid reward feedback. So that the idea was that increased the motivational value of that cue on those trials, because it would be linked with reward. And what we found, which is pretty interesting in my view, was that actually on the trials in which there was no reward available, we found that it really didn't matter whether the cue was informative or non-informative. There was no evidence that participants were utilizing that cue. So in other words, even though they could engage proactive control and prepare effectively for the demands associated with the upcoming target, when there was no reward, they didn't do that, and maybe that's because, the benefits are not that great in this case relative to the cost of doing that. But when the rewards were present, reward cues were present, and the cue was informative, now we saw that there was a significant reduction in the interference effect. So this means that the participants then were utilizing the information available in a way that was kind of linked to whether it was also of motivational value. So the key idea here again was that the reward and task informative cues interacted to reduce interference costs. And then what was also nice is in a follow-up study that Kim did in this paper really showed that the timing of the reward cue was critical. That not only was it important that the reward was kind of present and associated with the information cue, but when that reward cue came on too late, right before the target, you didn't see the same effects as when it was early. So it's kind of like you need to have the ability to utilize advanced information to engage this more proactive control, and the kind of motivational signals need to be there in the appropriate time as well. So that was just, kind of one of a number of findings that I think we and many other people have shown that reward and reward motivation seem to be linked to proactive control. And again, if anybody wants to stop me here and ask me questions, they can, or I can go on to the next part. Okay, no questions, I'll go on. So, that brings a question of like, why in the first place? Why might motivation engage cognitive control? And, one of the things that me and other colleagues, it kind of came to is really thinking about cognitive control in terms of the kind of value-based frameworks that had been arriving in the decision-making literature as well. And so really, I think there's kind of four components to this idea. One is I've already kind of mentioned that the maintenance and updating of cognitive goals, in particular in this kind of proactive form, may be intrinsically costly, computationally costly. So that means that our cognitive system might be biased against utilizing them. Instead of this kind of default, assumption I think that we might have that people are kind of using their full cognitive resources at all times, actually maybe, there's this kind of law of least mental effort, as my colleagues, Matt Bodvinick and Wouter Kuhl described in some work. And so that means that then we might want to prioritize cognitive goals according to their motivational or subjective value. That's a kind of an important dimension under which we want to activate and select and maintain goals. And that, one way that we can, do that prioritization is via kind of incentive cues that are present in the environment that we can link to those goals, so that if incentive cues are present, those may have the ability to modulate how goals are represented and maintained. And that, the whole kind of, I think, framework really puts this into the kind of role of, or the kind of context of value-based decision-making, that we want to think about the engagement of cognitive control as being a value-based decision that is weighing cost and benefit trade-offs at all times in terms of whether control and which kind of control is engaged. And one framework that's been really influential to me and others is work that started with Matt Bodvinick and Amitai Shenhoff, and now Amitai has continued on and really, I think, done the most work on this in his lab, now at Brown University, really thinking about the idea that when we are specifying kind of a cognitive control signal, that there is this, these dimensions of thinking about, okay, what is the kind of effort cost associated with that signal? And what is the motivational value that we can link to that? And then there's this third part, which they're starting to work on more recently, which I think is an important other dimension, which is, the efficacy. What is, if we engage in cognitive control, what is the likelihood that, the outcomes that we are anticipating will then be obtained? So it's not just, what's the value of the outcomes, but, what's the translation between the control and that. And so that those factors, these various dimensions are integrated together, and that's what refers to, they refer to as the expected value of control. And I think one of the key ideas in this framework is that there are certain brain areas that might be, play critical roles in this process. And in particular, the dorsal anterior cingulate may be a really key decision-making center in which to translate the integration of these various motivational factors with kind of the effort of control signals, and then to link that to then a specification of the control policy that will be implemented, where the control policy gets implemented in regions like the lateral prefrontal cortex. So I'll just tell you a bit about work that we did, kind of that links to this, but also into the really this idea of integration, which I think is an important one. And this is work that my former student Debbie Yee, who's now actually at Brown working with Amitai and his group, developed, called the motivational integration task. And what was interesting about this, going back to the point I made before, is that what Debbie decided to do here was to really see, okay, there's a standard approach that is used now in many studies of pairing, cues, information or task cues with reward cues. So here there were different reward cues that specified how much money was available on a given trial for performance. And this was a task switching condition where you had to either decide whether the stimulus was a letter or, whether you do a letter task or a number task, decide whether it's a vowel or consonant or odd or even if you're doing the number task. But the other part that was really, I think, interesting about this was that the feedback that participants got was actually liquid feedback. So in this case, the liquid feedback was the way that participants knew that they had obtained the monetary reward on that trial. But the liquid feedback had a valence property. So we had either positive or appetitive liquids, apple juice, aversive, salt water, or neutral, which was just a tasteless solution. And all three liquids meant the same thing. It meant that you got the reward. But when we varied them, then we could also see how the motivational valence of the liquid impacted behavior and brain activities I'll talk about in just a minute. So there's some details about this, but the key thing that she found, though, was that the reward rate, the likelihood of getting the reward, in addition to being affected by the monetary value, so that is, the more reward was available, the better participants performed and the more likely they were to get that reward. But in addition to being affected by the monetary value, it was also affected by the liquid. So they actually did better overall when the liquid feedback was juice relative to neutral, and they did worse overall when it was salt water. So it was if the participants were integrating these two kind of reward or incentive signals together and combining those to extract out what was the motivational value of their task performance on that trial. And so that's the idea that it combined both of those. And also just briefly, I'll come back to this in a minute. We also found that the task switch costs were also reduced, meaning that it did seem to have a direct cognitive control benefit, not just a general task performance benefit. What was also interesting, and just briefly to say, and I'll come back to this in just a minute, is that when you looked at participants' self-report motivation, which we asked them about each condition, that their self-reported motivation explained additional variance in how they did over and above the individual conditions, suggesting that people actually kind of aware of their motivational level as a function of the different conditions, and that was an important factor in the performance. What's also cool is that Debbie did a follow-up study where we manipulated the type of appetitive juice and had three different types of appetitive juices, and that varied in terms of particular participants' preference for them. And we found that, if you rank order it in terms of their preference, that also explained variance as well. So it's suggesting here that there really is this kind of subjective and idiosyncratic component too, which really, I think, justifies calling it motivation in this case, because really it seems as if their performance is driven by the way that they subjectively experience the rewards that are available on a given trial. Just briefly, I'll just say that Debbie also did this with older adults and found that actually the older adults look pretty different. It didn't look like they were actually integrating the money and the liquid together. So suggesting that this kind of motivational integration computation that seems to be going on in a task like this may be subject to group differences as well as individual differences, which is also pretty interesting. And we've done a follow-up neuroimaging study that I don't have time to talk about yet that's kind of looking into that. But for Debbie's dissertation, she then went and used this paradigm in a neuroimaging context, which is also kind of challenging to deliver liquid rewards in the scanner. But she did that and found that, as we had predicted, that the anterior cingulate was the place in the brain, one of the few places in the brain where we found that this integrated value of the liquid and the money actually seemed to be encoded. And so this is just showing that the activity in the anterior cingulate reflected both the liquid properties as well as the monetary properties in a kind of integrated way. And even further, Debbie went on and did a mediation analysis and was able to show, and this was also, I think, pretty interesting, that she also got the motivation ratings again for each of the conditions. and found that that explained additional variance. And in fact, it really seemed like the best mediation model was one in which the incentives, and this was a within subject mediation, so trial by trial mediation, that the incentive condition on a given trial modulated the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex, and it seemed like that was most proximally impacting the way that they reported their motivation. And it was the motivation that then explained the change in reward rate. So it really seems like you might think about the anterior cingulate here as reflecting the integrated motivational value being encoded of the stimuli of the trial, and then utilizing that to send a control signal that then is critical for modulating the behavior and the cognition. So getting to that part, let me just talk about, sorry, before I do that, again, I'll just stop if anybody has any questions on that before I go on.
There is one question.
Yeah.
From Alan, you focused on rewards, but where does intrinsic motivation, a la Ryan and Desi, fit in here?
Yeah, it doesn't, in the sense that we didn't in this study measure that, but the motivation ratings may reflect not just the the experimentally manipulated factors, which were the liquid and the money, but also participants' intrinsic motivation to do well. So they reported on how motivated they were to perform any of these types of trials, and that seemed to really actually predict their performance. But their motivation could have reflected other factors besides experimentally manipulated ones. I think it is a really important issue to track. And we know, of course, that, this is, again, what got me started in this was this idea that, when you're doing cognitive tasks, some participants seem to be very intrinsically motivated. They, they enjoy doing the tasks. They want to do well. They may have a lot of conscientiousness. And so you don't have to give them rewards, and they're just, performing at their very best. Others, it really seems as if the exogenous manipulation of incentive value is really important. So I think, going forward, I do think these things need to be parsed out and, figure out better ways to measure the intrinsic component to the motivation. And that wasn't our primary focus, but I do think that's a good issue. So thanks for that question. Any other question? All right, let me go on then. So there's, I think from the very beginning, and one of the reasons I think people in cognitive neuroscience are interested in this is if there are these kind of ways that cognitive functioning, cognitive processing seems to be, modulated by things like reward and motivation, where is that interface happening between those two, and what is the particular mechanism by which cognition can get modulated? And so there's been lots of work done on this. This was early work that was showing that actually when you look even at single neurons within the dorsal prefrontal cortex and working memory tasks, that their activity patterns are modulated by reward cues, and that does seem to predict the behavioral benefits, of the reward. And so really seems like prefrontal cortex is a locus. Also interest in the role of dopamine there, and other work on showing that that it may be that the reward cues are serving to modulate dopamine release, and that may be the proximal reason by which the changes in prefrontal neuronal activity are occurring. We also showed this in humans, showing that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we showed sustained, persistent, elevated activity in working memory trials when those were modulated by reward versus non-reward. And there's also been a kind of more network view of this, that we want to not think of this in terms of just individual brain regions, but in terms of network interactions. And that, there's now, I think, a fair bit known about the way that regions like the frontal parietal attentional network, which as it says involves both the lateral frontal cortex, the medial frontal cortex, and the posterior parietal cortex, interacts as a network with other networks that seem to be encoding value, like those involved in the orbital frontal cortex, insula, ventral striatum, and with these neuromodulatory broadcast systems like that seem to be important for the release of dopamine and modulating circuit or whole network-wide activity. So that still doesn't actually tell us, though, really what at a kind of algorithmic level is actually changing. And so what we wanted to try to do is see if we could get some traction on that. This was work by Jo Etzel, who's been in my lab and amazing research scientist for many years. And what she did was kind of took on this idea that maybe there really is this kind of enhanced coding of task goals, and that there's kind of more, we can think of like a sharpening of representations. And the way we could get at this was using neuroimaging with decoding approaches. And so went back to this cue task switching approach. In this case, we didn't use the primary rewards, just monetary cues. But we were able to kind of utilize the fMRI to focus on this kind of pre-stimulus period after the task cue had been presented, but before the target had been presented, to see what was happening in terms of brain activity as a function of reward. And I won't really go into the details about this, the methodology, but for those of you who know that decoding approaches are really powerful in that they allow you to actually quantitatively characterize the degree to which information about brain activity can give you information about particular stimuli or conditions or task cues or behavior. And so that's what we asked there, is like, where is the activity pattern that provide information about the to be performed task? And so we actually just did this on the note. We had two separate sessions, one in which there was no incentives provided, and that's what we trained the classifier. It's really important in this approach to do what's called cross-validation, to train the classifier on one set of data and then test it on another set of data. So we trained it on the data in which there were no incentives, and then we tested its classification performance about what task was being performed in the separate session in which there were intermixed reward and no reward trials. And what we found is that pretty much throughout the frontal parietal, but pretty exclusively to the frontal parietal control network, we found that that's where we could decode what task was being performed on a given trial. But the more interesting part was then when we tested it, and we tested it separately in terms of how well you could classify what task was being performed as a function of whether it was an incentive or a non-incentive trial. We found that in a number of regions and in the frontal parietal network as a whole, we found significantly increased task coding accuracy. In other words, the brain activity was a better indicator of what task was being performed on incentive trials relative to non-incentive trials. It was suggesting as if that task representation was kind of more clearly encoded in the brain. And we linked that to behavior, and that the improvement in classification accuracy on incentivized versus non-incentive trials actually predicted across subjects the improvement in performance accuracy. So this was a statistical mediation test suggesting that it really was this enhancement and reward-related decoding that can explain some of the improvement in behavioral performance. And then to me, what was actually the most interesting is that we could directly do test of pattern discriminability. And this is a kind of complicated figure, but the main take-home point is that you could directly show that the representations of one task versus the other task in this frontal parietal network were more separated on reward trials than non-reward trials. And that was really why it looked as if the encoding was better, because there was actually kind of more discriminable or sharpened difference in the representation. So this is really, I think for human work, it's kind of the best way we have right now to demonstrate that there really is a change in the neural coding of particular information as a function of motivational value. And I just wanted to kind of give a shout out that after we did this, it was really gratifying that another group, really excellent research group, did a very similar type of study, but using nicely different decoding methods, representational similarity analysis, and different neural imaging methodology of EEG, but basically found the same exact finding, and actually were able to, because of the EEG, show greater temporal precision, and further show that the effects of task coding really appeared to be specific to the switch trials, in which the cognitive control demands were the kind of greatest. So you don't need to know the details about the figure, but basically the behavioral effects seem to be primarily implemented on the trials with the greatest cognitive control demands. And so it seemed like the reward cues were really modulating the way that the participants updated their task goals in a function with the task cues, and that was what led to the behavioral benefits as well. So, okay, I'm going to finish up so we have time to talk, and you can ask me questions. But just to summarize, really went through kind of, I guess, 3 kind of dimensions here. The how dimension. So, argument is that reward motivation might have a particular linkage with the enhancement of proactive control. That it really seems to involve the utilization of preparatory effects and this anticipatory temporal dynamics, and involves the timing of when that reward information is available. And what we've argued again is that proactive control might be the kind of aspect of cognitive control that is most computationally costly, in which the system might be most biased against utilizing it, even though it may be effective, unless the motivational value is high enough. So that cost-benefit trade-off might really play out primarily with proactive control. And that the control really does seem to be modulated by the integrated motivational value that reflects both the kind of valence type signals, and we showed that with the imperative and aversive cues, as well as individual idiosyncratic preferences. And that really kind of dovetails with this expected value of control framework and a mechanism within the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex for doing that integration and then being part of that decision system. And then in terms of where that kind of pays out, in terms of the motivational impact on cognitive functioning and cognitive control, might be in terms of the sharpening the neural coding of task representations. That may be really where the kind of rubber hits the road, and we were showing that with this decoding approach in terms of discriminability. And I didn't talk about, but if you want to ask them out for a talk, my former students, Andrew Westbrook and Jenny Crawford, have been doing really nice work that in thinking about how to actually quantify the cost of cognitive control, and utilizing this paradigm that Andrew developed called the COGED, the cognitive effort discounting paradigm. And Jenny Crawford's really done a lot of work with that as well, especially looking at how this might be useful for understanding changes that happen with age, in terms of how cognitive control gets computed or estimated in terms of cost-benefit trade-offs. All right, I'll just thank everybody in my group and lots of collaborators over the years, lots of funding support, and thank you for listening. Happy to take whatever questions you have.
Thank you so much. We are now open for discussion and questions. So again, you can use the Q&A chat if you want to type your question. You can also just type in there that you have a question. You can also raise your hand, and I'll ask you to unmute, whichever. While we're waiting for some, I can start. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of primary versus secondary incentives. You chose to use primary, and I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that and throughout kind of all of the tasks.
Yeah, well, I just see that. Nice to see Kim and Jenny are here, so maybe I could let them talk about it, because they could probably get a better answer than I could. But I'll just say, from my perspective, that the idea about primary rewards is that when we're talking about monetary incentives, it's really hard to show I think that there's something about the intrinsic motivational value that is driving, because reward cues can serve, and this has been a lot of the other literature, attentional functions. It can be like a way of just demonstrating salience, or the it's almost like a different way that you can indicate to a participant, this is the important thing to pay attention to or to perform based on. And we don't really know, though, that it's having a motivational impact. When we're using primary incentives, number one, we don't have to communicate it symbolically like we do with monetary incentives, especially if you're doing it in a way that people can directly consume it. So then you can actually, measure things that are happening at the time of consumption as well as the time of anticipation. And, as tried to show in the study that Debbie did with the motivational integration, it's possible then to match in a way that I think is more close, the intensity versus the valence of the stimuli. So you can play with that, and then also you can also look at things like preference. So that was the whole point of doing the different liquids, was that somebody may really like strawberry juice and another person may really not like strawberry juice. If we think it's having a motivational impact, then that that your preference should actually make a difference on how well that is modulating performance. And so I think there's a lot of things that can be done. It also, just as another point, it makes links to the animal literature, which of course, it's much more standard in to be doing primary reinforcement with animals. And so we can get that continuity. Well, there's something else I wanted to say about that. I mean, you can, maybe it's different in terms of, it was interesting to us that we actually found changes with age, because one of the reasons we were doing that was we thought actually, monetary value might change as a function of age. There's always been this question in the economic decision-making literature about whether older adults value money to the same degree that younger adults, but we kind of assumed, that liquid would be being more primary and not symbolically represented might actually, have an impact in the same way. And of course, now then you have this other issue that we didn't think about, that maybe there's a perceptual or sensory difference that's happening with age. So there are other factors. I'm not going to claim that primary incentives are the perfect thing to use, but I think it's important to think about and vary that.
Great.
Oh yeah, and let's give a shout out to Kim, unless Kim, you want to say it yourself?
I just put a note in the chat specifically about the use of punishment or penalties. We're interested in this idea that monetary penalties often involve giving money or some sort of desirable outcome to the participant and then taking it away again, which is not exactly the same as receipt of a aversive outcome. So we're not using juice in my lab, but we are currently using threat of shock.
Great. Alexandra Freund, unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really, really dense and interesting overview. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I was wondering, and I hope I'm not being totally off, because cognition on this level is not so much my area of expertise. It's more the motivation part. But to the degree that control is effortful, I was wondering whether it might not in and of itself take on an intrinsic motivating value. So you learn, it's like the learned industriousness kind of idea. You learn that when you put in effort, your performance goes up. And so it's very instrumental. And that in this way, the effortful control becomes rewarding also. So it's not just a cost that you try to avoid and you need to sort of like think about where to, or not think about, but it needs to be directed to the more valuable outcomes necessarily only, but that in and of itself, there is something rewarding in exerting the effortful control. And if that's the case, what about, and I'm sure that you have compared this, but, and I missed this, what about like the control that's not effortful, that does not so take away resources, whatever these cognitive resources may be, right? I mean, one could probably spend hours and days and weeks talking about what cognitive resources are, right? But so if there is a sort of a cognitive control that does not involve costs necessarily for the system, but that are constraints that you put on your system, that you learn, would you expect then totally different results for this kind of control, or would you assume it's basically following the same patterns that you find?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great questions. Really appreciate that. And it's why I think we need people that are involved on the motivational side, as well as, people that are interested in the cognitive neuroscience side. And it is something, we've thought about a fair bit. But I don't know if I have a satisfying answer for you. I will say that, I got interested, when I started thinking about and reading about things like need for cognition, and this idea, that there appear to be, personality traits in which, people, and we all know, people who really enjoy like doing Sudoku and, and mentally stimulating activities, and other people that really avoid that. So it does seem like, there's both intrinsic value for some people in effort, and also, but intrinsic cost. The way we've tackled that is I didn't talk about, but this cognitive effort discounting task, in which we actually, allow people to choose for themselves whether to engage in a more effortful task for a more valuable outcome, or a less effortful task for a less valuable outcome. And then we can actually quantify the kind of difference in value by trading off how much how much better the outcome is for the more effortful task versus less outcome. And we actually, and Jenny, if she's around and wants to talk about this, can speak to this. We were assuming, and Jenny developed a variant of the paradigm to kind of show that maybe some people might actually favor the more effortful task and be willing to give up, benefits to do the more valuable task. But it actually turned out in our hands that it was very rare to encounter that. And even when we did, it seemed like it was more like a failure to understand the instructions. And we didn't actually get good correlations, even though I know Jenny tried pretty hard to show that the paradigm, this cognitive paradigm, although it correlates with a number of things, including real world behaviors, it didn't correlate with things like need for cognition. At least we couldn't replicate an early pattern that was indicating that. So I do think somehow this idea of kind of learned industriousness, or the value of effort, which seems to be real, and it seems to be something that that is expressed in at least some subset of people, at least in the way that we've experimentally tackled it, we can't really find a kind of trace of that. It really seems like, at least in the ways that we're studying it, people are more really trying to avoid the cognitive effort, and they require, kind of better payoffs to get it. With regard to your second question about, can you have kind of cognitive control that is non-effortful, and will you show different patterns of that? I mean, that's also, where I was kind of going a bit with this idea between proactive and reactive control, that I think it really is the proactive form of control that probably is the one that feels more subjectively effortful to participants. But, getting a good handle, and that's why we turn to the decision-making part of it, because to me, it's really hard to get a good independent handle on what subjective effort is. And so we try to quantitate it in terms of behavioral preferences and in terms of how people choose, rather than, what they say, because we didn't really know that we could get at it that way. But, so in other words, I'm trying to say is like, to show that non-effortful control has different motivational properties than effortful control, I think we need to really be able to kind of demonstrate in a kind of rigorous way which is effortful and which is non. So my intuition is that the proactive reactive distinction might tap into that, but I don't trust that that's really good enough to really bank on. And so So that's just a short way of saying, I wish I had a more satisfying answer to your question. I don't know, Jenny, if you, I don't want to put her on the spot, but maybe Jenny has something to say about it too, because it's something that, I do think is a really important question. We just haven't really, I think, gotten any data that I feel like speaks to it that well.
Jenny, you can unmute if you want. If not, that's okay. We have more questions. One from Sebastian. Thanks for a great presentation. In many of the studies you have shown us, you focused on gains and rewards cues, but some people also use negative outcomes, such as saltwater, where it seemed people's responses were similar or even smaller in older adults. Did you find any indication of loss aversion in some of your studies?
Yeah. Again, maybe other people could speak to this better because I'm not remembering. My memory of this, I mean, we've been interested in this idea of loss aversion, just like a lot of people are in kind of decision-making literature. I don't think that's what describes, at least in our hands, what the older adults are doing. I'm not saying, I mean, there's other work that suggests that, like, at least for older adults, there might be differences in loss aversion that are happening with age. Maybe Kendra wants to speak, but I know Kendra's done some work on that. But we didn't find that there's ways, and this, I think, again, where Kim, the work on primary punishments versus monetary loss, I think kind of that construct of what loss aversion is that the same as wanting to avoid a punishment? Or is it, when we're talking about gains versus losses in a more of an economic sense versus punishments versus, rewards in a more motivational or affective sense, I don't know that we're talking about the same thing. So I do think, that's one of the things I think is still a really active area of research, is kind of distinguishing between, things in which gains and losses are playing a role in decision-making processes versus when we're having things that are having a motivational impact. And I don't think those are the same. And I think we need to be really clear about that. But again, I don't have anything profound to say. So maybe I'll let, if anybody else wants to chime in, feel free.
Yeah, I can weigh in and just, this is sort of speculative on this point, but anecdotally, I do feel like, at least in our own data, punishments don't necessarily enhance cognitive performance to the same extent that rewards do. And I think, you could think about there being potential valence effects, but I think part of what's potentially going on is also these affective aspects of the incentives that we're using, which I've been, sort of struggling with, like, our affective versus motivational aspects of stimuli. Are they disassociable? Because they do tend to work together. But just sort of anecdotally, I think it's generally unpleasant to be receiving these aversive outcomes in a way that potentially derails people's cognitive performance. And so you could think about there still being this motivational drive that's here, avoidance oriented or negatively oriented, but there's also sort of, especially when you're talking about a primary punishment, there's also this sort of like sensory affective experience to the receipt that I think has a potentially separable influence on performance from the actual motivational dimensions. So I don't, I think that's something that still sort of needs to be disentangled, but that's one of the reasons that I think we don't always see comparable benefit.
Kendra, do you have any, any perspective? I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I'll just jump in. I mean, I've done I feel like a very little bit of this right now. So one thought we did to the older adult piece, we did a large study where we didn't find any effects of age on loss aversion. That's the one, like, kind of concrete piece of evidence I have about aging. But what I've started to think about is maybe it's more context dependent, that older adults, and that we need to explore the context in which we're talking about the losses. And so if it's a loss that the older adults are already experiencing right now, you know, if they feel, I think I'm going to bring up my dad. I always use him as examples, but he's very worried about his cognition going down, and that's very salient for him right now, and it seems to focus him. And so I think that the threat of those potential losses, that's very motivating to him, whereas losing money is not a big deal to him in the same way. So that's where I am on loss aversion. The other thing I will say is I feel like we just don't know very much about the negative side of things. You know, like when we did a meta-analysis looking at temporal discounting and aging, we couldn't include like temporal discounting for losses because there were only 2 studies that looked at losses, whereas we had, you know, like 30, 40 some in the positive domain. So I think it's also just been understudied, and that's part of the reason why we're all kind of like, we don't know what's going on. So those are just my random thoughts on that.
I mean, just to follow up, one thing that I kind of came to appreciate more, but also the difficulty, is the fact that, you know, when we talk about incentives, and I think this is again where people, you know, from the motivation, maybe more social personality, you know, appreciate than people in cognitive experimental, is that, you know, you really need to think about the category of the incentive and also the way you're kind of operationalizing it, and be careful about that. You know, I see a lot of people that talk about like social or health things where, you know, I don't know if I would say that really qualifies in the way they've operationalized in the experiment, you know, and I think it's hard. I mean, Jenny did this really great, what seemed like a great study where we were interested in social feedback. And we found these cool video clips where we could actually have people giving like real social feedback, and they were actors, and they were like saying stuff like, you know, if you died, nobody would even care. And we thought like those would have this really cool impact on behavior. And we kind of contrasted with the liquid feedback, and it didn't have any impact. And I was like so surprised, you know, because it seemed like, but it, you know, again, I just feel like it's tough to do it well. And, you know, and you know, that's why I also got suspicious of, you know, other approaches that I feel like are not taking seriously, you know, how we characterize it. But that's why, at least with the, you know, the primary incentives, I think it was a little bit to try to say, let's take more seriously what, you know, what it actually means to get an incentive. And, you know, can we kind of think about its motivational value in terms of kind of properties that other people have spoken about as being motivational in nature. And I think, you know, we talk about older adults, you know, I think again, you want to think about what is the loss that you're talking about, and really paying attention to that probably will make a huge difference.
Great. I think we're going to have to end there. Thank you so much, Dr. Braver, for coming and being our 4th speaker. We are going to take a brief hiatus for the MCM, the Motivated Cognition Meetings, the talk series, for probably maybe December, January, and maybe we'll be back. Well, we will be back, but hopefully by maybe February. So keep looking at our website. We should we'll post kind of the new speaker lineup, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening, everybody. Take
Great
care.
holiday season to all. Thanks.